Hi, everyone. Welcome to this 40-day journey offered by the Looking Within Center called A Soft Landing After a Bumpy Ride, Conversation Starters with Your Inner Life. Charles and I are here with Randy Stuhldreher in his recording studio at his home. We're really excited to bring this journey with you. Just what to expect is that beginning tomorrow, you'll receive a daily email from me with some cliff notes about that day's theme that Charles has written to help you walk through that conversation starter. And then we'll have an audio recording. We've been making those here with Randy that will be attached to your email. So look for that. I'll schedule it really early every day, and you'll find it when you get up or any time in the day and evening when you have a chance to listen to it. So we're so glad to have you along on this journey. Our Looking Within ministry in general supports us in the important task of looking within. And now in these 40 days, in our daily conversation starters, we'll explore the inner life as that soft landing that we seek in life. As I mentioned, we've entitled our 40-day journey, A Soft Landing After a Bumpy Ride. A bumpy ride on an airplane is our metaphor for today. Have you ever experienced turbulence on a plane, maybe even a lot? If you haven't, I'm sure you can imagine a pretty unsettling moment. And if you have, it's pretty disconcerting, isn't it? At its worst, pretty frightening. And you pray for a soft landing. And that's our metaphor for today. For most of us, for most of our lives, life is a fairly smooth ride. Occasionally there are some bumps along the way, and then there are those moments when life feels completely out of control. There's nothing we can do but pray for a soft landing. And though we pray, our hearts are still filled with fear and dread. We're not experiencing any soft landing. And Charles, that's where you come into the conversation. And we're so glad to have you and your reflections lead us through this 40-day journey.
Thank you, Julie. You've done a good job of setting the stage for our 40 days together with these daily conversation starters. About 3 years ago, my life was going along quite smoothly. I had just retired as a pastor. Karen and I were making plans for what comes next. Then I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. Suddenly, my ride was no longer smooth. I was in the midst of that proverbial bumpy ride. I could not find any soft landing. I could not see it down the road. I could not even imagine it. What a shock to my system. And after 42 years as a pastor, having guided many people through their own bumpy rides, I couldn't find that soft landing for myself. For the first 6 months, I was really lost. But in time, things did get better. I noticed life was a little better after 1 year and a lot better after the second year. And now, finishing up my third year, I am so grateful for this diagnosis of cancer. How did this happen? How did I find that soft landing? It was all about my inner life. Starting the day after I received the diagnosis, every morning at dawn, I went for a walk. To pray? Well, maybe a little. I just didn't have much to say to God once we got beyond the question, why? I would describe this time walking not as time of prayer necessarily, but trying to restore some equilibrium in my life. So instead of conversations with God, I had lengthy conversations with my feelings. How was I really feeling about this diagnosis? My thoughts. Well, what do I do now? I started to settle into these conversations. I also processed my life. How much time do I really have? And what do I do with the little time that remains? As I processed these things, my thoughts and feelings, my life, I found that I had a little bit more to say to God. Looking back on my early morning walks, as I tried to make sense out of what I was doing, I realized I was getting better acquainted not just with God, but with my whole inner life. Thus the title for our 40-day journey together, Finding a Soft Landing After a Bumpy Ride, Conversation Starters with Your Inner Life. What brought me back to a soft landing after the diagnosis wasn't just conversations with God, but a robust interaction, conversation if you will, with my entire inner life. So in these 40 days, I share with you some of the highlights of these conversations to help you more fully engage with your own inner life. So, what do I mean by the inner life? I provided you with a couple attachments in this email about the working model of the inner life. If you notice at the attachment, you'll see that I've placed feelings, thoughts, body sensations on that diagram of the inner life. I've also placed the circumstances and events of my life, and finally, I've placed God. I engaged all of these in a rich dance with each component of my inner life that led me into a closer relationship with God and that soft landing I so desperately sought. As you look at my model of the inner life, you will notice a fourth component, 3 inner voices. These became essential to my processing of the inner life. I never really connected these with my inner life, though I've read about them at great length from such teachers as St. Paul, Martin Luther, Thomas Merton, Christ himself. So, along with my working model of the inner life, I've shared with you my understanding of how St. Paul describes the 3 inner voices. I know this is kind of technical, but you may want to just have this with you as you go through these, because really the whole 40 days talks about all 4 of these, but especially the 3 inner voices. I think in Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 2, verse 20, he sums it up really nice. He says, "It is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me." You may want to memorize that and kind of hold on to it because it just unpacks so much of what we're going to be talking about. So when St. Paul says, "the I who no longer lives," I think he's referencing an earlier self that is still present, an earlier version of you. I will call this the small self. It's the voice of scarcity and fear. You'll know when this voice is speaking. The Christ who lives in me, well, that's God speaking to you. It's a newer voice of what has happened when God becomes real and alive to you. This is your Christ self. It is the voice of abundance and self. Now, these 2 voices have some rather robust conversations. And it's this third voice, in me. It is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. That is the you who stands behind the other 2 voices. This is the watcher who chooses which voice to live by. As I say, this is a little bit complicated, but keep it with you. Refer back to it as we go through these conversation starters. And you will see how these 3 voices will move us along in a really productive time of processing our inner life. I look forward to sharing these 40 days with you as you too begin to explore and find that in your inner life is where God has provided you this soft landing.
It's me. Thank you, Charles. And thank you to our listeners. We wanted to give you just a little bit of context and more foundation today as we start this journey. Each day coming up, you'll get an audio recording. We just wanted to greet you face to face today, but it'll be an audio recording, usually about 6-7 minutes. So we'll look forward to greeting you in that way. So let's travel together now as we navigate the bumpy rides of daily life. And really, that's our motivation for this journey, isn't it? We want to move through the bumps and the challenges more smoothly as we seek a soft landing by being more conscious of our inner life and having conversations with our inner life. We wish you great blessings, God's blessings in these 40 days, and watch for your first email tomorrow on January 24th.